Thank you so much to everyone for being here this afternoon. Okay. My name is Rachel Garrett. I'm a PhD student in engineering education, so I'm moderating our panel today. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of our panelists, and then we're going to go ahead and get started with questions. We'll start out with a couple of questions we have prepared. You're also welcome to raise your hand at any time, and you can ask some yourself. So the three panelists that we have today are Dr. Alice Polly, who is online. She's virtual with us. Her pronouns are she, her. She is a professor in the School of Engineering Education and also affiliated faculty with Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies program, as well as Environmental and Ecological Engineering. Thank you to Dr. Polly for being here. And then in the room with us, we have Dr. Karen Murray, and she is a professor in aeronautics and astronautics, as well as the associate head for undergraduate education, and she has some great industry experience that will be helpful for us today. And then finally, we have Olivia Brandt, who is a PhD candidate in materials engineering. We use the pronouns she, they, and is a leadership team member for the Grad WIE network. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here. We really appreciate your time. We're going to get started with the question, and we'll start with Dr. Polly online if you want to get us started. What are some of the unique differences to mentoring female identifying grad students as opposed to male identifying students?
So that's me, right? Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you, or at least hear you. Thanks for the introduction, Rachel. I appreciate that, and the pronoun shout out. I'm currently on sabbatical, so thank you for facilitating online participation. I also wanted to acknowledge before I took on this question that I'm coming from the ancestral lands of the Wea, Miami, Potawatomi, and Peoria people. And because I want to recognize that the land grant mission of our university is predicated on stolen indigenous land, like the land grant thing is related to stolen land. I'm also a white person. I'm married to a man. I have two kids that I gave birth to, both of whom I had while I was an associate professor. I have struggled with anxiety and depression for much of my adult life, including after my first kid was born. And I have ADHD, which I learned a year ago and has changed my life since then. So happy to talk about any of those things in any of the questions. So the question of how is mentoring female identifying grad students unique from mentoring male identifying grad students? I love the snapping for the male identifying and female identifying language. I want to say that I don't think it's unique, actually. I think there's overlap, but I want to sort of resist anytime that there's like a binary setup of like, how is this thing different from this thing? There is always overlap, right? Nature does not think in binaries, I saw on Twitter the other day. There are men and non-binary people who menstruate, who have babies, who feed their babies through lactation. Like, they're like all things that may be positioned as what differentiates men and women is, in fact, there's a lot more complication to it, right? So in addition, no one is just a gender and not a race or a sexuality or a class, ability, disability, all those things, right? So no one is just women or men, even if we, acknowledge that the problems with that binary. And people's awareness of their gender and how that's relevant to their lives changes over time, right? So I do research in using the idea of gender. I'm faculty and teach courses on gender theory. So my definition of gender that I use from scholars who write about this more is that gender is a way of bringing reproductive differences between bodies into the social arena. So they make, various different differences between bodies relevant. Okay, so given that caveat, there might be some patterns that are shaped by social relations that we find ourselves in, and organizations that shape themselves around how women are, because white women remain the majority, even in engineering, of women, largely how white women are positioned to be, right? So of my master's and PhD mentees, 5 have identified as women, 4 have identified as men, 1 is identified as non-binary, and 1 was still figuring things out. Of these, 5 have been domestic people of color or indigenous people, One is an international person who's minoritized in the US. 4 have identified as white. I've also had gay, sexual, straight students who know they're neurodivergent, and those that find out later, disabled students, and so on. So there's a lot of complicating features that I am using to resist the question. However, I did think of a few things that might be useful. I think both women and men have learned that you shouldn't bring personal issues to work, and that people who identify as women tend to have more issues that they need to deal with because of social circumstances they're put into, and are maybe more ready to let go of the exhortation that they shouldn't bring those issues to work. I think people who identify as women find themselves more expected to care about gender issues and to conform to particular notions of what acceptable gender performance is. Even though men have gender, right, and bring things up relating to gender. I think people identified as women might be more aware of gender-based microaggressions, but that's complicated by how white people are unaware of race-based microaggressions. I think the folks who identify as men have, in my group, and other mentees have perhaps found it more difficult to talk about feelings, to admit they need help and to ask for help. And probably that's because they've been policed to believe that, right? I'm not saying that there's reasons why they have been, they have perhaps suffered consequences for bringing them up in the past, that they have learned from, and now they don't do that anymore, right? That kind of thing. So this is a cliche, right? This idea that maybe people who identify as men don't talk about their feelings and don't ask for help, but it's also a feature of toxic masculinity, which is really, I think, prevalent in engineering, and which people who identify as women can also reproduce. But all the other things, I think expectations have really changed. And I try not to bring any more generalizations to people based on how the gender they identify as, because there is so much overlap. So I try to become aware of social circumstances, ask questions about what things mean to students, and we go from there. So that's a long question, but you did start with a person who does like gender research and gender theory. So carry on. Tag.
No, I appreciate the length of your answer and the detail that you included. And I always appreciate your inclusivity as well. Dr. Moran, would you like to?
Sure. So I do not have the expertise that Dr. Pauly has, so I'm not going to be able to speak as eloquently, but and my answer will be quite a bit shorter. But I think it's probably going to be a non-answer. I was thinking about this a little bit, and I agree with Dr. Pauly that I don't really differentiate in how I advise my students. But what I feel and what I hope is true is that because I have a lot of female identifying students in my research group, I feel like the male identifying students are able to express themselves in ways that maybe they have not been able to do before. So I feel like on the whole, like we are I'm going to use some sort of biased terms here, but we're a softer space. And so it feels to me like my male identifying students don't have to be like all like rah, 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 because we're all just kind of struggling together through this thing that is grad school. So I think it's working a little bit, and I mean this in the best possible way, but I've had many of my, not many, that sounds horrible, several of my male identifying students who feel comfortable crying in front of me. And that means a lot to me, that they can show that in front of me, that they're willing to show that vulnerability in front of me. That I think, generally society says that men should not cry, which I find horrible. I don't understand why we would tell people that they can't express one of the most basic emotions that we have. So I try to advise everyone overall in the same way, but then I'll say within that, each student ends up needing their own special advising, and that you can't tell beforehand what they're going to need. Like one student, you might look at them and based on how they look, you might be like, oh, this student is going to be super independent and, they're not going to need anything from me. Well, maybe they're the one who ends up needing the most hand-holding. And another student might come across as looking all fragile, but actually they need the opposite. So that to me is the bigger challenge, actually, is figuring out with each student, what do they need from me? And that can sometimes take quite a while between us, we figured out this is how our relationship is going to work versus this is how my relationship with another student works.
Yeah, thank you. Olivia, maybe we can kind of flip the question of, based on your, you're a unique person with your unique identity. How have you lived for mentorship that complements that during the school?
Okay, yeah. So, well, I'll try to also answer the first question to kind of keep the playing field level. So again, just a little more background on me. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. I'll be graduating at the end of the year. So I'm kind of one of the senior most lab members in my group. So I have 2 or 3 first-year grad students that I'm mentoring. I have mentored both male and female identifying undergraduates, and I've also done some at my undergraduate research institution on mentoring them as well. So I've got a little bit of experience mentoring, and obviously since I am still a grad student, I am being mentored all of the time as well. So just to start with the original question, and then I'll get kind of to how unique individuals is that I think there is value still in determining that there is unique value in women or female identifying students versus male identifying students. And that is something we need to acknowledge, is that sometimes perceptions of how you identify do play into the mentoring role. And I think that is important to acknowledge because oftentimes when I mentor my female students, I seem to think that, or I give them a different perspective than my male counterparts. And I think that is partly due to the fact that I am female identifying. And so it is easier for me to connect with people of my own gender identity. And, but that isn't to say that I don't provide value to my male colleagues, or that the male colleagues cannot find value in what I do as a person of female gender. So that's kind of where I go. I think also that mentoring is very much a part of where you find community and support. And so where you find that could be with people of similar genders or different genders, as well as different class levels, right? Professors, other grad students, etc. And that makes a difference in terms of how you're mentoring. Just to go based off of the question of, how do you mentor unique individuals? I think that depends a lot on the person. I know I have found support and mentors both in my field, outside of my field. So I was the council chair for the President's Council of Student Advisors for the American Ceramic Society. And that's a long way of saying that I was the chair of a student group of people in the American Ceramic Society. And what I found really important was finding a mentor within there that could help me become the council chair that I wanted to be. And so I sought out a lot of mentors within my time as the chair of the PCSA, as it's known, as well as kind of within my own sphere of influence as a grad student. I find that mentors are very helpful and important. And so I've sought them out a lot. And I know that not everybody does that. And some people also need kind of mentors that are a little more just kind of sporadic, whereas I oftentimes need to be able to meet one-on-one at a certain time, a certain date, in order to get the mentoring that I need. And so that is unique to me. But again, it depends kind of on the specific person and what they need. And I'm always willing to kind of talk to people about what they need.
Thank you very much. And then our next question will kind of combine 2 questions into one. So what have your experiences been like based on your identity in engineering? So if you're female identifying, does that affect any of your experience? And then in addition to that, how can you ensure that your mentor specifically is accommodating to your specific identity? Dr. Murray, can start with you.
Sure. So as Rachel alluded to earlier, I did spend some time in industry a long time ago now. Long enough ago, I think that things were different, and also in a different country that is a pretty male society, I guess. So as a young female engineer, I got things like talking to the salespeople, trying to order things, being asked to please put the engineer on the phone. Because obviously I couldn't be the engineer. Being asked to pour the tea at meetings, because I was the only woman in the room. So obviously I'm going to be the one who's pouring the tea. So, I got all of those kinds of things, just, down to like really unpleasant things, like people sending me extremely vulgar jokes over email, things that I like to think are not happening as much now. This was just normal. This was not something that I even thought to be offended by. This was just the way that life was. You got, when I say it's vulgar, like it was beyond what you would even think. But that was just normal. And I played along with all of it. And then it took for me going to grad school and being in a different environment to realize that there was a different way of operating, that this in fact did not have to be normal. And then when I returned to South Africa after grad school, things had not changed that much there. But now my eyes were open in a different way. And I started, when people would say things to me or do things to me, I would be sort of like, because I was weird, I was back home. And so part of me would be like, oh, okay, why am I being upset by this? Like, come on, like, get over it. But then I started doing this thing where I said, like, would Ian have done this? And Ian was my postdoc advisor, and he was amazing. And so every time one of my male colleagues said or did something to me, I would think to myself, would Ian have done this? And then when the answer was no, I'm like, okay, this is unacceptable. And then it got so bad that I left, and I came here because I could not fit into that anymore. I like to think that things are better. Certainly things are better here than they were in South Africa. But I know that my students still run into issues, and I know it starts even in undergraduate teams where, the women on the team, what's she going to be doing? Editing the report, right? She's going to be the one pulling everyone together, making sure that, people do their homework. And it's not always like that, but it's more often that I see that than I don't see that, that kind of thing. So I think those little things continue. I have, to my great disappointment, been in meetings where I've said something and it gets ignored. And 5 minutes later, that thing happens that they tell you happens, where a male person in the meeting will say the same thing. And everyone's like, brilliant idea. And I'm like, I said that. But of course, I don't want to be whiny, right? So I just kind of sit there quietly fuming and complain to my husband about it in the evening. So I think those things still go on. And I realized some time ago that it's important for me to acknowledge that even, a 19-year-old in my sophomore class is still going to be experiencing those things, and to acknowledge that and not be like, oh, things are all great for you now. Because I think then that denies that experience. And then if it does happen, then maybe that person doesn't have a would Ian do this mantra yet. And they think, okay, well, obviously this is the way that things should be. So I think that got the first part of your question.
Yeah, I think we got the second as well.
Okay, great.
It wasn't something Ian would do, that to stand up for yourself and make that change that's necessary. Thank you for sharing. Olivia, do you have some experiences to share, ways that you can stand up for yourself when things do happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to acknowledge that I think things are better, and it is because people, our allies, as well as the women themselves, have been starting to advocate and realize that this is not okay. And I think it is probably better than when you were in grad school. And I want to also acknowledge that things have been complicated not only by social media and the influence of the internet, but also just because that there is still this intrinsic systemic problem of kind of gendered in the workplace. And so I have experienced some of it. I know, especially through like social media and stuff, kind of that has been a part of it. I think we are also getting more women mentors. So I know I've had a lot of those throughout my kind of high school and college career that have really helped me. I didn't have an Ian, but I did have a what did Mrs. Stedman do? So I think that is something as well, is to figure out where are your mentors, where are your advocates, and what would they do in certain situations, as well as what is not acceptable. And what is acceptable for me may not be acceptable for you. And determining kind of what that looks like for you is a soul searching exercise, and something that I think everybody kind of needs to do. in order to kind of understand where they are, who they are, and where they want to go. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of mentoring. Obviously, I still have a long ways to go, and there's still a lot of things that I need to learn in terms of mentoring and being mentored. But it's certainly gotten better.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Dr. Pauly, do you have some experiences or ways to defend yourself to share?
Sure. Yeah. I'm currently in the School of Engineering Education, which is a majority of women. Faculty are majority women. It's majority white. That's the case across both the faculty and the staff. And our graduate student population is majority female also, both cis and transgender folks. So that's unusual, right? Also, my undergrad was in chemical engineering in Canada, which half of my class was women, which I did not really appreciate at the time. And in graduate school, I was in industrial engineering, where, again, we had a large fraction of students who were women. That is to say, how do I say all of that? And yet, patriarchy is present in more gender diverse environments too, right? So a lot of the microaggressions that Dr. Murray was talking about, I also have stories like that, right? And like, there are more than I would like to actually make myself revisit, let's just say. But I found, so much value in Me Too, in sort of the same way that Dr. Murray said, in the sense of like, I had normalized all of this as, I guess if I'm going to be in engineering, this is just what I'm going to have to live with, right? This is inevitable. There's nothing that I can do about it. And it made me realize that the things I'd resigned myself to as inevitable truths are still wrong, right? And we could do them differently. So social relations, sexism, racism, homophobia, they're not inevitable. We can do something about them. So that was sort of really memorable for me. So yes, you want to think that the sort of dinosaurs and unjust policies have moved on. They haven't completely, although I do think things are better than, when I did my master's with a whole bunch of first year engineering students, asking them how are they preparing themselves to be isolated as women in engineering industry environments, where they all told me, oh, you grad student, things are better than when you were a student only 4 years ago. And then they come back to me after their internships and they're like, oh, you were right. Like, I think things have so collectively improved. But, as to the question of sort of how do you help make sure that mentors sort of acknowledging your needs, which I think you put in there, Rachel, do you want to talk about that later, or should I say something about that here?
Yeah, if you want to talk about that now.
Just a little bit. Yeah. I think that oh, sorry.
No, we can kind of shift to that question for all of you if you want to start though. Your mentor, like as a grad student, how do you ensure that they are aware of and can mentor you, consider in your identity?
Okay. Yeah. I think there's a thing where you have to think about how much of yourself to invest in changing systems and standing up for yourself and others, and how much you need to protect yourself by potentially withdrawing, right? That it is a long haul, improving systems and culture, right? So one thing that I'll sort of advocate, I'll say two things. One is that I am a coach who's trained with the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. Purdue's an institutional member of NCFDD. All of y'all who have purdue.edu email addresses have access to all of this amazing online professional development stuff that takes into account minoritized positions. I found it, I participated first as a faculty member when I was not yet pregnant with my second kid. So my kid is now 7 and I have been involved ever since. They advocate a networked model of mentoring. That is to say, you cannot get everything from one person. That is too dependent, right? No one can do everything. And if they tell you otherwise, that's a lie and a step towards a form of abuse. Like, that's not true. So how do you put together a network of mentors? And then the other thing I was thinking about was, don't, if you feel safe enough, don't hide the things from your mentor that are important to you and to your position as however you identify as in terms of gender, because your because your mentor expresses discomfort about them. Like, people have learned to be uncomfortable talking about bodies, about social relationships, about menstruation in particular, but they matter to our work, right? Pretending you can deny realities of our bodies is a destructive philosophy. And so those mentors who are uncomfortable when you bring those things up might not be the best helpers, but don't, like, if you feel safe, don't censor bringing them up, because that helps create a culture where we don't talk about those things, right? And that is a part of a culture that positions people who have bodies identified as female in all kinds of specific challenges, right? So those are the sort of two things I'd throw in there as to, like, how do you ensure that a mentor's accommodating you? Like, don't hold back on those things because you feel like you're supposed to. There's lots of things we've learned we're supposed to do that conform to patriarchy, and they don't have to be that way. Tag.
Thank you. Olivia, do you have any perspectives as a current grad student? How do you ensure your mentor is accommodating?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I've kind of alluded to, I've got at least 3 core mentors. One is male identifying and 2 are female identifying. And as Dr. Polly said, I think it is important to have more than one mentor, because I cannot get all of the information, advice, and support I need from just one person. And so I think that's really important. And whether or not those mentors are classified as a mentor or they're just kind of somebody you go to in the lab, say, that doesn't really matter. The label of what you call them is irrelevant, at least in my perspective. And I think it also gets to how you can kind of advocate and tell yourself is, I would start with somebody, again, who you feel safe with. Now, whether that is necessarily your primary advisor, a secondary mentor, or even, again, a senior lab member, right? Start with somebody who you know you can trust, who you feel safe with. Start there, and then you can move to somebody who may be scarier or who kind of seems like is a little more prominent or important, say, in your life. I think that's a really good way to go about doing it, is to start with, okay, a senior lab member. Okay, well, have you dealt with this before? How have you dealt with this? Kind of getting that perspective as well. And then again, also bringing it up to the mentors that you have, really advocating for yourself, making sure that your voice gets heard. I know I've had the best conversations with my mentors when I'm open and honest with them and are able to tell them, hey, look, this is going on. This is what's important to me. I need help. How can you help me? That's really where I've gotten the most valuable information from my mentors.
That's great advice. I appreciate too. Sometimes it is easier to start with the lab mate or someone more senior in the lab, kind of work your way up, be helpful, the easier way into things. So finding allies is always good.
Remind me what the question was.
How can you kind of ensure, I guess, as a mentor, how are you ensuring that you are accommodating with your students' varying identities? You answered this a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything more to add there. I think, again, I try to be open with my students. I will say that I choose to keep my personal life pretty personal. So, you know, when I go home, like, that is a separate space for me. And I know that different faculty have different ways of doing this, and some faculty welcome students into their homes and do that kind of thing. For me, the way that I deal with all the pressures of work, which feels like it's always like trying to creep into every inch of my body, is to kind of have that boundary between my work life and my home life. But within that, I try to be open with my students about kind of who I am, and especially about my weaknesses as well. So just last week, I was upset with one of my students because they had not been making progress on something, and we had missed something with another research team, long story. And I was quite upset with him about it. Well, then it turns out, when we sort of dug into things a bit more, that I had actually missed this thing back in January. And so, you know, this thing that I was upset with my student about last week I had missed back in January. And so the next time I met with my student, I was like, hey, I need to talk to you about this. Like, I know that I got upset with you about this thing that you missed, but I realize now that I missed it in January. And so I messed up there. And I want you to know that, you know, the same strict standards that I have for you, I have for myself. And I messed up here. And I was the one who started this mistake. And so it's on me. And I want to acknowledge that to you. And so, you know, I try to, because I'm not perfect. And I make a lot of mistakes. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'm always trying to figure out what each student needs from me in order to succeed. And so I think I have to be completely open and honest with my students. So if I'm going to call them out when they mess up, I've got to call myself out when I mess up, and I've got to talk to them about it as well. And so, you know, be vulnerable in that way to my students. And I think what I'm getting at in a roundabout way is by me being open like that, hopefully they can feel similarly that they can be open with me, because we share these things. Like, I do not pretend to be perfect and all-knowing. When I make mistakes, and when I make mistakes, I talk to them about it. And when I talk to my student about this particular thing, he was immediately like, oh, but you know, you're busy and whatever. I'm like, no, but I still messed up. And the other thing I want you to take from this, I said to him, is it's important, you know, when you're in charge of people, when you mess up, I want you to do the same thing that I'm doing here. Like, also acknowledge to them that you've made a mistake. So I guess that's my roundabout answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. It's always nice to hear that advisors are open to having those honest conversations. And I think a lot of times we work with people who won't admit their faults. So that vulnerability is really appreciated for grad students. I have a question specifically for Dr. Pauly. As you mentioned earlier, some of your research really touches some of these areas. So is there anything that you've learned from your research over the years that you could share in terms of mentoring grad students and ensuring that they do different spaces?
I didn't hear the last bit. So anything I've learned from research over the years, something.
Yeah, that would align with just in general the topic of the seminar. Anything that aligns with mentoring graduate students, making them feel comfortable with their identities.
I admit that I don't study that directly, I have to say. So I guess one thing that I could say is that, you know, I'll say, sorry, let me start over. Sort of the biggest thing that I take from the research literature, given that this isn't sort of looking at individual psychological differences or so forth, is not my area of study. I look at more structural things. There was a paper published in American Psychologist in 2005 by Janet Hyde, who it turned out was my neighbor growing up, which I didn't know at the time. She called it the gender similarities hypothesis. And she talks about how there are, even though we have these sort of large cultural story about how women and men are different, and separate and different, that there are there are no binaries in learning. And there might be patterns, but as I said earlier, there's a lot of overlap. And the question when we are confronted with, say, research that says, look at this gender difference, the question for us to ask is, what is the effect size of the differences? So I'm a qualitative researcher, but that is the only quantitative question that I regularly ask or remember to ask at quantitative dissertation defenses is, what is the effect size of various different things? And so there are almost no enduring gender differences with large effect sizes. In terms of psychological differences, there had a meta-analysis of, I think, 9 different large-scale meta-analyses, it was a meta-analysis of these different large-scale studies. And there might have been a moderate effect in aggression, but this too was under debate when you consider how parents protect children. Okay, so I think there's also something useful of thinking about how non-binary folks and gender non-conforming folks and trans folks complicate our understandings of genders, like how gender matters in questions of mentoring and so forth. So folks who are identified as female at birth, but now who identify as men or as non-binary, how do we file them in our experimental results on gender, because non-binary folks and trans folks have always been around. And those folks are not negligible because of their small numbers, because they actually tell us important stories about what gender means and how we can understand our own gendered experiences. So that's what the research has sort of told me, and is useful for thinking about when we go out and we look at research about gender and engineering and mentoring. How do we understand the results of that research? I don't remember if you had a specific question of like advice, but I think that's what I've got at the moment in terms of the what I take from research. I will throw in the bit about my research, which is, if gender is understood as how we bring reproductive differences between bodies into the social arena, how we make them relevant, then gender differences can be produced by organizations through different kinds of policies, through different kinds of prioritizing values and so forth. And that's the thing that I'd be like happy to chat with anybody more about, because that is the focus of my research. Like, how do we set up environments which produce gender imbalances of the sort that we see in engineering and the race imbalances that we see in engineering? So we can't. It's very seductive to just like focus on psychological things, like psychological theories and these small group things, and like how research conforms to our sort of cultural understanding about how gender must matter. Not to say it doesn't, but there's a different question of like, just because something is socially constructed, it can have real effects, right? Money is made up, but there are material effects of money. But I think it's really important for us to not be sort of seduced by all of that sort of research that conforms with a bigger story about how there are differences, but keep in mind how differences are produced by structures that have developed over time.
Thank you. I'll ask another question. Anyone in the audience is also welcome to ask. And on Zoom as well, please feel free to send a chat and let me know if you unmute yourself or just send a question in chat. We're all welcome to ask things that you have in mind as well. But we'll ask the question that actually Dr. Pauly recommended would be a good thing to discuss, which is when you're looking for jobs, what should you look for in an institution that values the contribution of scholars or workers who identify as women? So maybe Dr. Murray, will start with you just with your previous experiences that you've had.
This makes it hard to solve the problem, but I think one of your first signs is going to be, are there other women working there? And that's always it. And when my students are looking for jobs as well, they pull up the faculty page and you scroll down, you keep scrolling and you keep scrolling and you keep scrolling, and there's no women, then that makes it harder, right? And if we're going to be choosing between two different positions and everything is equal, and one department has no women and the other one has women, I'm going to encourage my student to go for the one that has women. So yeah, you can be the trailblazer, but that's going to be, that makes it harder, right? So, but then having sort of been on the other side as well, trying to recruit people, it's like, well, if no one's going to come, how are we ever going to change things? So, so within that, I'd say, you look at how people are treating you, like what are they talking about during the interview? What are they asking you about during the interview? Do they share maybe like, we have no women in our department, and yes, you could have seen that from the website, but do they say that and then say, and we are working to improve that, and here's what we're doing to improve it, and we have a specific goal to change that. So I think listening carefully, looking what's going on. If a place does have women, are they letting you meet with them, or are they like hiding them because they're all angry? And listening maybe to the subtext that people will talk about during interview. I'm obviously most familiar with the academic environment because I've now been in academia for a long time. But I'd say even also in industry, you want to look at, how are they talking about it? What does their department look like? Do they bring up things around and I know you have to be careful when you're interviewing people, but do they bring up things around like what do they have available for childcare? Are they trying to convey an environment that is friendly to all kinds of different families? And so in my own case, like it's just my husband and I, but I define that is my family. Like, and I sort of, I thought about this a couple of years ago because I got sort of upset about things, but, just because we don't have children doesn't mean we're not a family. And so, I'm looking for a workplace that is welcoming to all kinds of families.
Thank you. Olivia, do you have any perspectives as you're nearing graduation, things that you're looking for in a potential employer, or even as you were applying for grad school, things that you looked at?
Absolutely. So I'll share both perspectives because I am looking at jobs. And so what am I looking for there? As well as what did I look for in a grad school? I guess I'll start with the grad school because that's the one that keeps popping up. So I applied to six grad schools and got into 5 of them. And so when I was going around and touring all of the different grad schools, Purdue stood out in one big aspect, and that was at the grad visit. We had somebody from the Grad Women in Engineering Network at the time, Gwen, come in and speak. And that was transformational because I had come from my university SWE program and I was looking to continue in a role like that. And so to immediately know that Purdue had Gwen and that they were cognizant and aware, both in my department and at Purdue, that women needed a space at Purdue in order to succeed was really important to me. And that was one of the decisions that made me come to Purdue. And then from there, I started coming to all of the Gwen events, as well as then got an opportunity to be on the leadership team and really kind of transform what the GradWe Network program looks like. And that has been really great for me, as well as I hope the program itself. What I'm looking for when I'm going into interviews and starting to look at companies, one of the things that I've actually found really helpful for me is I go back to their LinkedIn profiles and I go back to June, which is Pride Month. And oftentimes a lot of the companies will have changed their logos or have posted something about their pride. And whether they had a Pride Day or a Pride Parade, or they changed their logo, something subtle that showed that there was a little bit more that they were doing rather than just, again, keeping their logo the same or doing something like that. That was important, as well as, again, looking at what are the people interviewing, what do they look like, what do they identify as well as who are the people you're looking for, identify as, and do they bring it up? So those are the things I've been looking for.
I'm going to steal that tip too of going back to James. Dr. Pauline.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for bringing the question up. So I think one thing to think about is that gender is not separate from other forms of oppression. So don't just look at women because that's often coded as white women. And if how good institutions treat people who identify as women can't be that different from how they consider race or sexuality. Otherwise, you've got new problems, right? So I would look at structure. Are there institutional policies that support or fund and then that people actually use the social realities of folks identified as women, but also other minorities in other social positions, right? Folks in same-sex relationships, folks who build their families through adoption. I really appreciated Dr. Murray's point about like you're looking for how they treat families of all sorts, including ones which don't choose not to have children, don't have children for whatever reason. I would look at if you're looking at like academic institutions, you're not looking at industry jobs. There are published public surveys if you're looking at a public school on satisfaction and compensation. Right, the Coach survey is a faculty survey, is nationwide. That has public results often. Ours does. And AEUP publishes faculty salaries, a study of faculty salaries at different institutions broken down by gender, race too, I think. I would look at leadership and how quickly they turn over. Are they all white? How has the institution used the promotion of white women as evidence for how they care about diversity? Or is it beyond that? Are folks in tokenized positions and what have they been allowed to get done? Okay. I would think about asking questions of workers who are at a different level than you, a lower level than you're coming in at, whatever that is. Do folks take parental leave? How do people talk about them when they're gone? Can people express gender outside of binary norms? How do they treat families of different sorts? And how is gender policed? So looking at bathrooms, looking at clothing that people wear, just walking in the hallways. What do people talk about? Like, is it more than just work? What are hiring patterns? And then I want to put a caveat on, like, start being aware of the image that the institution projects. Like, I appreciate the point about pride, and also it can be window dressing, right? So you don't showing pride symbols and so forth is a step, like that's good, but it's not enough, right? So don't let it be enough. Make sure that you don't get sort of sucked in by publications, the website, and so forth that portray a particular image of the university or the institution that is driven by media and marketing. Because on one hand, that's like, it's a form of propaganda in some way. And also, like, you can see that also with how folks use Black and brown faculty on brochures and so forth, often without their consent. So make sure that you're sort of savvy about how you're getting a sense of what the reputation of a school is, or of a firm or a company is, and how much of that is produced by media marketing. How much is it, endorsed by the folks who actually work there, particularly the folks who are coming in at a lower level than you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from anyone in the room or online? Yeah, go ahead.
I think I'm particularly interested in knowing how, like the example you gave, how you navigate spaces where you say something and then somebody says the same thing. But I just said that. How do you handle it eloquently without sounding like you're crazy?
Yeah, right.
I'm going to repeat the question just so those online can hear. So how do you kind of handle things eloquently when an issue does occur? Like, what is that step?
Yeah, so one of the things that I try to do to help in those situations that I learned from something I read years ago somewhere, is the kind of amplifying when I see people who are generally not heard in meetings make a good point. So then, what is your name? Noella. So I might say, like, oh, I want to build on something that Noella just said. And so I try to, do that kind of thing so that even before the 5 minutes go by, if, I heard you saying something, then I don't let the 5 minutes go by for someone else to take the point. And I call you out by name. And I said, this thing that she said is important. We need to pay attention to it. So that's kind of a roundabout way. So, so it means that the sort of the victim in the situation doesn't have to address it. So maybe, for all of us to kind of be looking for that. And I've seen other people do it in meetings, and I've had it done to me where someone's like, oh, Karen said this thing. I want to make sure we note it. And then that gives me like a little boost as well. Like, oh, cool. Someone thought I said something worthwhile. And then also it doesn't get lost, and it doesn't leave me in making some kind of like either like whiny or passive aggressive thing, or, just getting frustrated and shutting down because, I said something and once again, I got ignored. So clearly you guys don't care about me. And that, it's a natural reaction, at least in me. But it's not a productive one. So, and I think the other one way, I guess, that you could try to do it is say, it's great that you made that point. I think it builds exactly on what I was saying earlier. And then, you kind of like take it back and talking about what we mentioned earlier, that, the world is getting a little bit better. I think when other people see that kind of being called out, they will be supportive. Like I feel like we're in a slightly better world where you're not going to be the sole person in the room trying to fight for yourself. Other people will kind of then pull on that. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Any other questions?
Can I add something to that?
Yes, absolutely.
I really appreciated that. And I'm dropping into the chat, so I don't know if someone can save it. A tool I think is really helpful. I amplify the point, Karen's point about essentially it's less important about what you do in this moment perfectly than doing something, because it is more important to create a culture where we interrupt that kind of thing, and where we hold people accountable, than to make sure that you do it right. Because you can always go back, you can try again, you can apologize, you can, like, there's all kinds of things once you have tried to do something. So that's the first thing. And this paper that I put in the chat by Daryl Wing-Su is about, he calls it micro interventions. It's a sort of response to the work that he and colleagues did on microaggressions. I think the framework's really useful. They talk about, I'm trying to scroll down here really quick, I won't go into it too much, but like making the invisible visible, right? Oh, I'm sorry, were you just suggesting that so-and-so did something because, you know, they're thus and such, right? Disarming the microaggression, educating the offender, seek external reinforcement or support. All of those have lots of different strategies that talk about in that paper, very practical strategies. Mm-hmm. But I think above all, the thing to first check on is the safety of the target, right? So it's not about trying to convince the person who said something wrong or problematic that they were wrong. I mean, it is also about that. But the first person we should attend to and care for is the person who is the subject of the microaggression, including if it's you, right? Attend to them first, and then think about how do you handle the person who made the wrong of some kind. So hopefully you can share that link. It's on the College of Engineering website, actually, because there was a bystander intervention training last week, which was really helpful.
Yes, yeah, I can do that as well. But thank you. We will send a link out to all of our attendees as well. Any other questions? Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, so again, thank you all so much for these perspectives that you shared so far. And just for an extra bit of like, who's the audience today? If anybody was invited to this that are participating either online or in person with us, they are either a current leader in the College of Engineering or will likely be a leader in their field someday. So we have our best of the best graduate students that are here, faculty, staff, and postdocs. If we're going to be leaders and we're going to continue working in the engineering space, either in academia, industry, national lab, whatever, how can we, no matter how we identify, make sure that the women that work with us and those women identifying people that are on our teams or part of the people that we're with are supported, that we see what types of challenges that they are encountering, and that we have their best interests at heart to make sure that all these things that we say are getting better, yes, they're getting better in large cities like where we have a big university here. What happens if we're going to a smaller town? What if we're going to a more rural area? What if the company that we're in is smaller and isn't as advanced in their ways of thinking, and they're still very male dominated, or they still have these old ways of thinking? How do we make sure, even if we're joining any of those groups, that the people that are on our teams and those that we're leading, that we're taking care of them and that we are driving the changes that are needed, and we're not just expecting somebody else is going to do that?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question for Dr. Polly and those online. But assuming that all you that are attending online or in person are leaders in engineering, you're going to continue in the engineering realm. How do we make people feel comfortable? How do we make women feel known and appreciated, and that we're doing things to be an ally to them? Dr. Polly, I know you might have to leave soon. Do you want to go ahead and answer first?
I just messaged my group that I'm running a few minutes late, and I will hop on and start their meeting in a minute. Love a minute to think about it, but I'll stall so that other folks can say something. I think two things. Thing one that leaders can do is to believe what people tell you are problems, and not to sit there and think about, oh, are people intending to be problematic? Are people intending to be set up environments that are problematic for women and people who identify as women broadly, or gender nonconforming folks? And instead look at impact, and your best resource to think about impact is the folks who are telling you what the problems are, right? I think another place to start from is start from a place where you assume that the system is working as designed to produce predominantly men and white people. And therefore, if you want to change that, it is not about making minoritized folks feel more comfortable if it's in the existing system, because the existing system is working as designed. And so how do you rethink that rather than thinking about comfort and belongingness is important, but not at the expense of the hard conversations about how the system produced the circumstances we have now. So that's what I think how do leaders then educate themselves, not by putting additional burdens on the few minoritized folks who are in their group to keep telling them stuff, but looking at the wealth of research in this space that is already existing to educate themselves. So that'll, I guess, that's 3 things.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being panelists today. We really appreciate all of your advice and words of encouragement and everything, and your inclusivity as well that you've always done for the department and your students. So thank you, Dr. Pauly.
Thanks for having me. I will hop off. See y'all later.
All right, Dr. Murray, would you like to?
Yeah, I think I'll pull on this whole theme of amplifying voices, but I'll put a little bit on the thing. I think listening is for me where a lot of it begins, right? So actually really listening to people. We rarely really get listened to. I mean, I'm a professor now, so I sort of get listened to in class, but not really, because they're on their phones. But when you feel like someone is really listening to you, it makes you feel valued, right? And so that's immediately a way to get someone to feel like they matter to you. And then as the person who's doing the listening, if you actually really listen, then a lot of the time, the person who's speaking will tell you what it is that they need. And I think for me, something that's been important is remembering to keep on listening, because I'm an engineer and I'm sort of a rather pragmatic person, I guess. And I always want to jump towards a solution, right? So I want to be like, okay, yeah, I see what the issue is here. Here's what I suggest we do. And so I have to constantly remind myself, keep listening some more. Like, make sure you actually really understand the problem. And then the other part that I continuously try to work on as well is then not flipping it around and making it about me. So you're different from me. And what happened to me and how I responded to the situation may be partially applicable to your situation, but I'm not you. And so I don't, I read on the internet about this thing, like with people like one-upping the misery. So you're just sharing a little story about whatever horrible thing happened to you on the way to work. And it may just have been that someone, went in front of you when you didn't want them to. And then the other person's like, oh yeah, that reminds me when I was in the 20-car pileup. Okay, fine, you win. So listening, people will tell you what they need quite often. And maybe they don't tell you the first time, maybe they don't tell you the second time, but maybe by the 10th time, when they realize that you actually are listening to them, then they'll share with you what they need, and then you can respond.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am kind of seen a little bit as a leader. And so it's really great to see that there are more people leading and wanting to be leaders, because I think it's a really great position to be in. That being said, I think one of the biggest things is, as Dr. Pauly said, is to educate yourself and be willing to be uncomfortable with the knowledge and education that you get. I think a lot of times, and going off of your point as well, is that it's not about you. And oftentimes the uncomfortableness is, okay, well, it's clearly targeting me. And so to be able to sit with the uncomfortableness and be like, okay, wait, this isn't actually about me. This is actually what I'm hearing. This is actually what it's about, is really important and powerful. And so making that listening point, and one of the things that really makes it easy to know that you're listening, and also to help people see that you're listening, is to be like, well, I hear this, right? Mm-hmm. This is what I'm hearing from this conversation. Is that correct? Is this where we're going with it? Mm-hmm. Rather than just saying, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution. Here's how I'm hearing this, rather than just saying, yes, this is how we solve this. Because again, as engineers, that is really where we jump to. And oftentimes as a leader, your job is to kind of get the problems and be able to say, okay, here's where I see we are. How as a group, how as a team, we can go about solving this. This is not a me problem. This is a we problem.
Any other questions?
One more
Yes.
thing, sorry, keep coming back to me. Really the main thing at this point, when we think about, my job is related to retaining our graduate students, our wonderful people that work in the College of Engineering, in all levels and all schools. The greatest way that we have of retaining anybody in industry, especially in this type of position for graduate education, is a sense of community when they get here. As you mentioned, Olivia, like coming here, knowing where resources were could make you feel quicker that you could maybe have a home at Purdue. So, Gwen, so with the Graduate Women in Engineering Network, we have Elizabeth that's with us. What would you say to anybody that wants to be connected, that wants to find out more, that wants to have that resource?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll also like make a note to Olivia. She's also on the leadership team with us. And that's our mission, right? Is to make graduate students feel included and have a space and have a community. We try to do events that are related to professional development. But also like building social community as well, because there's a lot of different communities that you can make. But they're important to your individual, and maybe some resonate more with one person, some resonate with others too. But we try to be attentive to that, and also like listen, kind of like that. Listen to what our graduate students are saying, and really make sure that we're supporting students in a way that we can support them best. So yeah, definitely get involved. We do stuff usually like every month or every couple of stuff.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I think is getting awareness, and sometimes it's not as easy to kind of have them kind of be presented to you, but to go out and find them is really easy to do. Actually, there's a lot of resources. Again, we as the Gwen send out a weekly email, but you can also kind of go through the departments, because there is a women in engineering department, so that is just kind of on the College of Engineering as a department. Another really great resource are the student resource centers. And those are, again, you can just type in student resource centers and there's a list of them. So those are really good ways to find your community. You can also find them through clubs and organizations, either at Purdue or around the community. I know I'm involved with the Wabash River Cycling Club. So there's a lot of different communities, and what that community looks like for you can vary differently, but also asking around, right? So like in my group, people ask, okay, well, how did you get involved? And I'm like, well, I told these people about this, or I found out about this opportunity from these people. So really talk to people, see what they are involved in, and then be like, oh, actually, that might be something I'm interested in as well. And obviously we have a Gwen pop-up on Friday that you are all welcome to. It's 11 to 12:30 in this room. If you'd like to come, we'll have a alumni, Dr. Linda Blevins, come in. She really was instrumental in getting the Gwen program started. So I'll just plug that real fast as well.
Thank you. So we have a question that's specifically for Dr. Murray. Do you think that the attitudes toward women are inherently different in industry and academia? And if so, when you're mentoring your current students, is that something that you include when they're considering the various career paths?
Yeah, so I don't know how industry is now, like from personal experience. I do feel that in the past, academia, because universities tend to be more liberal environments, would be an easier place to be as a women identifying person working. But I wonder perhaps sometimes whether as universities we kind of rest on our laurels a little bit. And so I do get the sense, just from talking to some of the women on our Industrial Advisory Council, that there are a lot of efforts that go on in industry to make things better. There was a very nice report, which I'm embarrassed to say, I still haven't finished reading, but it's really good. That was commissioned by Lockheed Martin, where so huge aerospace player, like they eat all the little companies. So, but they commissioned a study and a survey of their own people on attitudes towards diversity. And it's really quite a fascinating read, and to see a big company like that, invest effort, and they're a multi-billion-dollar company, so maybe they spent $1 million on this. Okay, so I don't want to like overemphasize things here, but those kinds of efforts are going on because I think companies are realizing that if they want to recruit top talent, then they've got to be welcoming to everyone. You can't just be like, we're just going to recruit a bunch of white guys and that's going to be good enough, because you're going to be missing out on a lot of really good people. So I think things are maybe a little bit better now than they were when I started. But something I was thinking about, and that I do think remains true about academia, is it does offer a flexible environment. This is not so much about just the attitudes, but it offers you things like, for example, it's easier to you can work from home more easily, although that has changed now with COVID, because I think a lot of people realize something like, oh, guess what? You can actually work from home. But, time-wise, like I control my time in a way that I did not control it in industry. I always think about like one of my jobs that I had, my car was parked like about 10 minutes walk from where my office was. It was that big. It was one of those huge facilities. And so if I wanted to go somewhere for lunch, I couldn't, because it would take me 10 minutes to walk to my car, 10 minutes to drive into town. And then, that would leave me 20 minutes to have lunch somewhere. And so, my life was just controlled like that. And so just the flexibility that academia offers you is very nice for the other things that you want to do in your life. So like one example for me is I like to run. And since we all realized with COVID that we can work from home, before COVID, I would go running at like 6:15 a.m. So I would do my entire run in the dark in the winter, which was fine because this is a relatively safe town. But, I see like a little halo around me with my little headlamp. So it's better than a treadmill, but barely. And now what I get to do is I get to get up, do email and stuff, wait for the sun to rise, and then I can go for my run. Which in the winter, like that, I go for my run like at 9 o'clock in the sunlight. So there are the flexibility advantages of academia, but I think, like I said, industry is catching on to this idea that we need to be looking at the whole talent pool, not just one small portion of it.
Thank you very much. All right. So a question in terms of grad students, particularly if someone is experiencing a really unwelcoming or toxic environment with their lab group, so they're just the environment that their advisor is set in, it's really difficult for them to be in. What steps should they take? Should they just get some alternative mentors and hope that positivity will kind of balance things out? They leave the lab group? Do they report the situation? What steps are available for them?
Do you want to start or?
I'm happy to start. So I think it's somewhat dependent on the person, the individual, and situation, kind of what goes on. If I was in this situation, I think I would start by going to other grad students in the department and seeing what their lab groups are like and what they're doing, because I think you can find a lot of community, especially if you want to stay within the same department. Finding out kind of from the other grad students kind of where you could possibly end up. I don't think you should tough it out if that's not something that is conducive to your mental health, physical health, or your safety. I think it's better to talk to your advisor or go above that to either the academic advisor or the department head. If it's a situation that you do not feel safe or that you can continue to function in, do not just tough it out. That would be my biggest piece of advice.
I agree 100% with the do not tough it out. I'm probably getting like old and crotchety now or something, but for all the wonders that academia has, it also tolerates bad behavior in a way that I think perhaps does not happen as much elsewhere, because we have tenure. And I'm just tired of like people getting away with being abusive to their graduate students, being abusive to their colleagues, being abusive to their staff. So, like I said, I'm getting old and crotchety. I think that if something like that happens, and just like you need to find someone that you can trust, and you need to go and talk to them, and you need to quickly find someone that you can trust and talk to who has power. So, you know, it's wonderful, like reach out to a graduate student, like, you know, someone that's kind of like a peer, to sort of get the lay of the land, but you need to identify someone in your unit who has power, and you need to go and talk to them about it. And so, you know, you need to find out who you can trust. So, you know, if it's not going to work out very well for you if that person who has the power is best friends with your abusive advisor. So, you know, get the lay of the land with your graduate student, friend or colleague, whatever, and then you need to get someone else involved there, and get extracted from that situation. If it's a person in your lab group, like another student that's creating that environment for you, then you know, ideally talk to your advisor about it. Again, if you feel like you can't trust them on that, then there's a bigger problem. And so then, you know, go back to the first case. But don't tough it out. It's not going to get better, you know, like abusive situations, like they don't get better. Like, yeah, like, you know, if someone has lost their temper at you once or something like that, and they can give you a genuine apology, and not a "you made me do that" apology, an actual genuine apology. I should not have lost my temper at you. I was wrong. You know, that you know, you can judge for yourself whether that was a one-off thing, but in general, like people who are abusive are not going to get better. So get yourself out of there before you've invested 2 years or 3 years or whatever in that particular situation. And that also, you know, ultimately helps us as a university to know about these situations. Like, it doesn't help if they're just underlying, like, sort of gossip, right? They've got to rise to the surface, so that we can address these kinds of behaviors. I think it's unacceptable, but we let it go because it stays this kind of under the surface thing.
Yeah, thank you. I'll add to that too. There are a couple of resources on campus. One is called Ombuzz, which most universities have. You can choose to report with your name or just anonymously. You can just let them know the situation, and it will go to a committee within the graduate school administration. Will help with that. And then the survey includes, like, what would you like us to do about it? There's different steps if you want to meet with them, if you just want the situation addressed. And then the College of Engineering has one specific to engineering graduate students as well. You can always go to Stephen, and I'm offering his services because he is offering.
Please do.
Yes.
Always and often.
Yeah, his goal is to help keep graduate students here to improve their experiences. So you're always welcome to email him with confidentiality as well.
I'll say on that just one last thing. I've even heard, you know, like my TAs, like sometimes like undergraduate students will be rude and aggressive to them. And then same thing, like if that's happening to you as a TA, go and talk to your instructor about it, like right away. You don't have to put up with that kind of behavior either. If you're in office hours with a student and they're behaving like that, like you say to them, like, I'm not going to talk to you if you are talking to me in that way. And if they continue, get up and leave. Like, you don't have to put up with that kind of crap. So just don't.
Yeah, and I appreciate the point too, that it's not going to change. I was a fourth year grad student when I changed departments, and it didn't change. It never did, no matter how much I hoped it would, or it changed my actions. The actions of others are not going to be controlled by you. So please take care of yourselves. We have about 10 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? Anything they would like to make sure it's in? Okay. I will ask one final one. And that would be, have either of you been mentored by women specifically in the past, or female identifying mentors? And has that been a different experience for you? Or if you haven't been, do you think that it would be a different experience?
Yeah, so I mean, as mentioned earlier, I have 2 strong female mentors right now, and one male. So I definitely see the value of having both. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're different or that they're unique, being mentored by a woman than a male identifying mentor. What I do think I get is that I think there is a sense of instant community and kind of camaraderie that I get with the female mentors a lot easier. It takes less time for me to realize, oh, hey, we have this in common, rather than some of my male mentors. And I do think that I can get what I need with both of them in different situations. So I think there is value in having both. I wouldn't say just have one or the other, or just, you know, don't go with the binary. Have a bunch of different mentors that can mentor you in different categories and different situations. And that can be irrespective of the gender of the person.
Yeah, I think that the point about having a mentoring network is really important. So, you know, look for different mentors. You're going to address different needs for you. I have not been a very good mentee, and I, in the sense of like I was really bad at asking for help and advice, and that's you know, one of my biggest regrets actually, because my life could have been so much easier if I just asked for more help and advice. But I got a sense that it betrayed weakness or something if I asked for help, because someone made a comment to me one year in a performance review about looking like I needed help. So I was like, fine, I'll show you. I'm never going to ask anyone for help again. Well, so no, that's not good. The only female mentor that I've really had was my PhD advisor. And she was much older, and so when she was a student and also, you know, working in industry, like she had it really hard, and I think it was difficult for her to understand that things were different. And so, you know, she sort of came with a lot of those experiences that she was carrying with her, and it made it hard for me to identify, because I was, you know, a self-centered PhD student, just, you know, in my agony of whether I was ever going to graduate and am I good enough and blah, 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 all that stuff, right? So it was all about me all the time. And I couldn't really understand her perspective much. And so it made it difficult for me to sort of have that immediate camaraderie in a way. It was actually difficult to have. But then when I became a professor, I started understanding her perspective like a lot better. And so now I have a very different sense of her and an understanding of what she was trying to achieve as an advisor. And I try to take from that again in terms of my own advising, and, you know, how can I be a good mentor then for my students, whether they are women or men. Or
Thank you so much. I do want to take a minute to thank a couple people before we close out. First of all, to Stephen McBride, Stephanie Porter, for dealing with a lot of logistics and getting lunch and everything. Also to people that have attended, whether virtually or in person. I've seen faculty here, grad students, postdocs. We have Dr. Jane Eagle here. So there's people that actually care about this topic. And so we really appreciate you coming. Thank you to the Graduate Women Engineering Network, both to Olivia for being a panelist and for Elizabeth for helping organize things and kind of get stuff together for us and some marketing. And then finally, we can please thank our panelists for all of their wonderful opinions and support and help from today.